This screencast is going to talk about the dermis. The dermis is the layer of skin right below the epidermis. Depending which resource you're looking at, the skin just has two layers, the epidermis and the dermis, or some resources list it as having three layers, the epidermis, then the dermis, and then the hypodermis below that, or deeper than that. Either way we look at it, we're going to look at the dermis now. Before we talk about the dermis, it's important to talk about the epidermal-dermal junction. Junction just means a connection or a place where things meet. And so you can see here, this is the ridgy connection between the epidermis and the dermis. It's made up of uneven ridges, so it has projections that are coming inward from the epidermis and outward from the dermis. So they kind of fit together almost like an egg carton or like those egg carton memory foam mattress pads. And so you've got one coming downward and one coming upward. And so it forms this ridgy kind of connection. When we look at it at the side, we draw it just as a squiggly line, but keep in mind this is a three-dimensional shape. And so it actually is projected in all three dimensions. When we look at the dermis is made up of connective tissue. Specifically, it's made up of a lot of elastic and collagen fibers. We'll talk more about these as we talk about the two layers, but because it has collagen fibers, the dermis is very strong. Because it has elastic fibers, it is stretchy, so it's able to stretch and then return to its original shape as long as it's not stretched out too much. There are two layers of the dermis, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. There is a very blurry blending between the two levels. It's not as distinct as in the epidermis. So here, the papillary layer form the papillae, which are the finger-like little projections that come upward. The reticular layer sits deeper to that, and when you draw it, you can see that there are more fibers, more densely packed fibers in the reticular layer than in the papillary layer. But otherwise, there's a very blurry blending between the two borders, the border of the two layers. So as I just mentioned, the papillary layer is made up of papillae, which project upward towards the epidermis. And these ridges are actually what form our fingerprints. So when we look at our fingerprints, we do have these papillae all over our skin. However, they're most abundant in our hands and our feet. What happens is there are friction ridges that leave a patterned impression. Our fingerprints are friction ridges that leave a patterned impression when we press them against something. Genes determine our fingerprints. So there are different types of fingerprints. There are whorls and arches and loops, and then there are different minutiae within there. But these are determined primarily or first and foremost by your genes. That said, fetuses change fingerprints as they move around in the uterus. So as they move, they kind of push and add, they kind of move the fingerprints a little bit, which is why even identical twins don't have the same fingerprints. They may have started with the same fingerprints because they have the same genetic code, but they move differently inside the uterus. So then we move deeper to the reticular layer. The reticular layer is very thick and dense. Again, remember these layers are both made of connective tissue. It has a really good blood supply, or it's well vascularized. So this is the layer that if you cut down to the reticular layer, that's when you're going to start to bleed. You don't bleed if you just cut your epidermis, but once you cut your dermis, that's when you'll begin to bleed because you do have a great blood supply there. Additionally, it's going to hurt if you get into the dermis because there are many sensory receptors and nerves there. These can sense things like pain, temperature, pressure, etc. There are elastic fibers and collagen fibers here. We did talk about both of these things a little bit earlier, but I'll reiterate them here. The elastic fibers give them elasticity. Again, that means they can stretch and then return to their normal shape. And then the collagen fibers provide both strength and hydration of the skin. So collagen is going to bind water to it in order to hydrate the skin. Speaking of collagen, you may have heard of collagen injections or creams. These are a little debatable how well they work, but the science behind them is that they're designed to help restore skin turgor. So turgor means like tightness because it's hydrated and kind of plump. So like a nice beautiful grape as opposed to a raisin, right? A grape has turgor, whereas a raisin does not. And so the way these work is they attempt to introduce new collagen, or they stimulate blood flow in order for the body to repair itself with more collagen. And so that's the premise behind collagen injections and creams, though the empirical evidence does not always support their use. Additionally, so we have our collagen and elastic fibers, but in addition to that, we have nerves, blood vessels, and receptors that we just mentioned. We also have hair follicles, so the hair originates in the dermis or in the border between the dermis and the hypodermis. And then you have sebaceous glands, which are going to produce sebum or oil. And then lastly, you have sweat glands. So just to quickly recap, the dermis is made up of two layers, the papillary layer, which is more superficial, and the reticular layer, which is deeper. They, as a whole, are made up of dense connective tissue, collagen, and elastic fibers. Within that, or the connective tissue is made up of collagen and elastic fibers. And then within the dermis, you're going to have nerves, blood vessels, receptors for a whole number of things, hair follicles, and two types of glands. As you can see, the dermis, which is the light pink here, makes up the bulk of our skin by volume or by depth. So that is our dermis.